Hey guys, it's Devest. I didn't like my first video on nuclear energy, so I decided I would unlist it and try to make some better written stuff on the topic, going through and addressing the problems with nuclear in more detail. Let's get started. First off, I thought I would talk about the Achilles heel of nuclear, which is cost. Unfortunately, I can't even give the average person on the internet the benefit of the doubt and assume they would understand what cost is. A lot of people who support nuclear energy seem to think that cost is a made-up number used to deceive people into opposing their ideas. In reality, cost is a measurement of what has to be spent in order to obtain an end product. We're typically using money as a relative measurement for that. The same way you would measure length in centimeters. So when I say nuclear costs so many times more than wind and solar, what I'm really saying is that it requires more labor, resources, and capital for the same amount of electricity to be produced. The cost of energy is a driving factor of everyone's quality of life, since all the goods and services you use rely on energy to be created. If you eat food, for example, first off, you need to power the machinery that is used to work the land, tilling the soil, planting seeds, and irrigation. Then you need nitrogen fertilizer, along with herbicides and pesticides. Then you need to harvest the crops, transport them to a factory that processes them into finished goods, then energy to transport them to consumers. This same analysis can be made for everything in your life. Your house requires energy to be built, clean, and running water requires energy, heating, your clothes, the electronics you're watching this on. Increased cost entails a reduction in your quality of life. Worse yet for other people who would be priced out of living because they can't reduce their quality of life much more. For the same reason that cost killed nuclear, now it is propelling renewables to make the green transition a reality. We have known about the negative impacts of pollution for thousands of years. The lowest caste in Asia were people who worked dirty jobs associated with disease and death. Ancient cultures created religious commands against eating the flesh of unclean animals. In Rome, they understood the effects of lead, but they still did it because it was the cheapest and oftentimes only way to achieve an end goal. Fossil fuels are no different. Now, wind and solar are the cheapest sources of energy in terms of direct cost, which is why we are moving away from fossil fuels. They were already the best decades ago when you factored in the indirect costs, but with more recent advances now, they are a better investment directly too. The terms direct cost and indirect cost here are important. A direct cost is something like the resources and labor you need to run a power plant, while indirect costs are stuff you don't see, like the environmental damage from emissions from fossil fuels. So why is nuclear so expensive in terms of direct costs? It's mostly the cost of the unique infrastructure requirements of nuclear power, along with efficiency shortcomings. I'm sure you've seen the meme about finding more advanced ways of boiling water. Basically, a nuclear reactor is a coal boiler, but with nuclear fission instead of combustion generating the heat, which demands a more expensive design. You have to deal with stuff like neutron embrittlement. This also undermines another common myth about nuclear power lasting longer than renewables. Sure, you can keep the same reactor running for decades, but you have to spend more maintaining it than it costs to replace old wind turbines and solar panels that have lived out their service life. The other thing is that nuclear power is not efficient either. Since it's a water boiler, it's only about 30% efficient, with most of the energy turning into waste heat. This is comparable to coal or oil-fired boilers, but in the modern day we are comparing nuclear to combined cycle gas turbines, which are 60% efficient and require even less infrastructure than coal or oil. And combined cycle isn't even competitive with wind or solar. Even if you were to tax carbon fully, it's unlikely that nuclear would be cheaper than natural gas. It may be cheaper than coal and oil, but there are also significant costs tied to nuclear waste that are unique to nuclear, making the comparison less favorable. And notice how I'm not comparing nuclear to wind and solar, which blow all fossil fuels out of the water already. If we reached peak oil, then we would actually have a point where nuclear would be cheaper than fossil fuels. But there will never be a situation where renewable energy is more expensive than a nuclear reactor. Ignoring the requirements for a nuclear reactor, a steam turbine itself without the nuclear reactor or the generator costs more than a wind turbine does. since it has to be built to withstand extreme temperatures, pressures, and filled with a constantly depleting and expensive working fluid. A wind turbine just skips all of that by having a shaft spun by the wind with some relatively cheap to fabricate blades. It's a similar story with solar panels, geothermal, hydropower, and even biofuels. You can't design a nuclear reactor that is simpler than these renewable energy sources, and there is no realistic nuclear technology that will do it better. Not molten salt, small modular reactors, fusion, or can-do reactors. Another problem with nuclear that is often overlooked is confusing energy density with energy return on investment. Creating 1 kilogram of 2% enriched uranium requires a metric ton of uranium ore to be mined and enriched, which takes a lot of energy in its own right. You get 3 watts back for each one you use, and that assumes that you are using electricity as your energy source. Almost all uranium is mined and enriched using fossil fuels. Even in countries that do have nuclear power and uranium like Canada, they don't use nuclear electricity to extract uranium. It's a waste of energy, but the uranium is so much more expensive that they can create a profit selling it that way. You also can't make a nuclear reactor cheaper than renewables by cutting safety regulations. That won't stop them from being more complicated than renewables. Beyond that, the reason nuclear reactors are so heavily regulated is because their potential costs from an accident make them so expensive that they can't be insured. A private nuclear operator has it in their best financial interest to minimize their expenses by doing the bare minimum that is required of them for safety, as prescribed by regulators. Remember, if we get rid of safety regulations, then we are telling them to go ahead and do the dumb thing that wasn't allowed before to save a quick buck. Damn the consequences. If you take that mindset and then multiply that by the tens of thousands of nuclear reactors you would need to replace fossil fuels, then you're going to have a few more Chernobyl disasters on your hands, and any money that you would have saved will have disappeared into the pockets of the shareholders for the company operating the plant, who will use loopholes to make the money disappear and then file for bankruptcy so that the public has to cover all of the cleanup cost. And that is how it would definitely go down, because maximizing profits is the only thing anyone in the business world cares about, regardless of the harm they cause. I don't think I can emphasize enough how much potential economic damage there could be from a nuclear disaster. Metropolitan New York has a GDP bigger than Russia or the Soviet Union did. And you would need to play Russian roulette with 1,500 nuclear reactors the same size as Vogtle 3 to replace America's current energy demand with nuclear power. But wait, what about France? It's true the price of electricity in France is on par with their neighbors, but remember, cost and price are not the same thing. The reason French electricity bills aren't through the roof is because the cost is obfuscated through government policy. The French have price caps on the sales price of electricity, which prevents the EDF from charging their customers what their electricity actually costs. But the price caps also mean that they lose money selling nuclear electricity. Now, if they don't turn a profit, then they can't afford to pay their operating expenses, and they'd be forced to shut down. But the French government solves this by giving the EDF money to cover the difference. That money comes from the budget, which is ultimately paid for by taking it out of other public services. So instead of paying for the cost of their electricity on their bills, the French pay the cost of their electricity through social costs, like cutting pensions. Subsidizing electricity consumption by cutting public services favors large electricity consumers. If you own a business that buys millions of euros worth of electricity, then you will end up ahead if the government cuts your pension worth 11,000 euros a year, along with everyone else in the country, to subsidize your electricity consumption. In terms of the real cost of nuclear energy in France, all they have done is imposed an extra burden onto the working class and elderly in order to keep the price of electricity competitive with other European Union members who did a better job planning their utilities. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you learned anything in the comments below, or if you want to lose an argument against me because you disagree. Until next time, this is Divest, signing out.